Uploader's notes. In the previous section, I neglected to mention that some of the quotations were repeated. I don't know why they were, but they were included in the original document. It was not an error on my part. I've done my best to remain as faithful to the report as possible. I apologize for any confusion. In this final part, the report includes numerous redactions. When converting the text to audio, I felt that the frequency of these redactions made the section too difficult to comprehend. To improve the flow of speech, for the benefit of the listener's experience, I've made the editorial decision to replace many of the redacted names with meaningful words. For example, if a victim's name has been redacted, I've replaced the redaction with the victim. Or if the parent of the victim's name has been redacted, I've replaced the blank with the father or the mother. Please read the description to understand better the editorial decisions I have felt necessary to make. This conversion took many days to complete. I hope many good people share it in full. You are welcome to rip this audio and upload it to your own social media channels. I personally put no restriction whatsoever on how this information is disseminated.
Part 61. Appendix 3. Institutional Failures. Police and Justice. Police forces nationwide ignored repeated reports of sexual assault, false imprisonment, and exploitation. Officers often arrived hours late to reports of missing children and then refused to take statements from victims and closed cases without examination. Girls were often arrested for drunk and disorderly behavior that followed assaults by the gang members. Bail conditions silenced whistleblowers while known perpetrators received no conditions or surveillance. Two-tier policing operated openly. Forces surrendered to threats of disorder from certain communities, fabricated offenses against critics, and allowed officers linked to the gangs to retire with pensions. The evidence from a majority of the witness statements shows that police forces across England and Scotland knew about organized grooming and sexual assault of children, yet repeatedly failed to protect victims, investigate perpetrators, or act on clear intelligence. Officers discouraged reporting, criminalized victims, destroyed or ignored evidence, and allowed perpetrators to walk free. There is also disturbing evidence that serving police officers were active members of the grooming gangs, while others went out of their way to protect the grooming gangs. This was not an isolated error. It was systemic across multiple forces and lasted for decades. Below is a fraction of the incidents of which the inquiry has been made aware. West Midlands Police. West Midlands Police failed. A victim, Officer Redacted, was directly involved in early missing episodes. Despite serious reports of a child being taken by older boys, no written statements were taken from the mother or child. The matter was never properly investigated. Officers attended missing episodes, but took between 2 and 4 hours to arrive. The response was described as wholly inadequate. The force closed cases, without safeguarding action, even when the mother explicitly stated her child was suffering sexual exploitation. Greater Manchester Police, including Tameside. Greater Manchester Police repeatedly failed a victim. PC Redacted, later dismissed, attended a multi-agency meeting and shouted at the victim's father to stop reporting his daughter missing. He did this in front of professionals. Officers on the missing from home team frequently failed to return calls. CCTV footage captured officers discussing not waking the father when they attended at 3 a.m. The force failed to enforce bail conditions on a known sexual assaulter, who immediately rang the father's daughter and threatened her life. Associates of the perpetrator attended the family home, and the police response was delayed and dismissive. The father's daughter was left in the company of groomers on multiple occasions. The force treated the father as the problem, rather than as a dutiful parent trying to protect his child. West Yorkshire Police. West Yorkshire Police failed multiple victims, including this victim. In this victim's case, the force closed an early report of a recorded sexual assault on a 13-year-old. With no investigation into the creation or distribution of child sexual abuse material. In this victim's case, officers routinely recovered the child from cars with adult men, but allowed the men to drive away without question. In this case, officers Redacted 1 and Redacted 2, among others, failed to act on extensive stalking logs, threats, and evidence of grooming gangs. The force repeatedly minimized disclosures, lost evidence, and treated victims as unreliable. Named officers in the victim's father's statement include those who ignored years of harassment and failed to link cases. South Yorkshire Police. South Yorkshire Police targeted Tommy Robinson with dawn raids on family homes and bail conditions. Robinson suspects to this day that the force often timed their actions against him to disrupt lawful protests. A South Yorkshire police officer, PC Hassan Ali, is alleged to have brokered a no-prosecution deal with child abuser Rashid Hussain. Under its terms, Hussain handed over a missing underage girl to police at a petrol station in exchange for not being arrested or prosecuted for her abduction. The force is repeatedly linked to early knowledge of the grooming gangs, at least from Sammy Woodhouse's case, in 1999 onwards, yet still they produced no protection. Officers discouraged missing reports and protected perpetrators. Merseyside Police. Merseyside Police failed a mother's daughter and her family. DC Redacted and PC Redacted discouraged the 12-year-old sexual abuse victim from pursuing justice. They emphasized paperwork, delay and her word against his as reasons not to proceed with a prosecution. Justice for a 12-year-old who was sexually assaulted was deemed too much hard work. This led her daughter to withdraw her complaint. The force failed to act on video evidence of assaults, threats, and ongoing harassment. After her daughter's death, the family faced continued intimidation with inadequate protection from the police. Police Scotland. Police Scotland failed in the Redacted case. DC Redacted received extensive digital evidence from a civilian specialist showing a man advertising as a Quran tutor who was grooming a child. Despite the evidence, relocated abroad, he reappeared and continued activity while under investigation. The force has systemic data failures and no specific marker for group-based child sexual exploitation and inconsistent recording of ethnicity data. This prevents proper understanding and disruption of networks. Metropolitan Police. The Metropolitan Police failed a witness. Officers attended the home after her report of a coerced and recorded sexual assault on a 13-year-old, but took no further action and closed the case without any investigation of the recording or its distribution. The force later allegedly assaulted the victim while she was restrained during an arrest. NHS services. The NHS, including its mental health teams, sexual health clinics, hospitals, GPs, and emergency departments repeatedly failed to safeguard children who presented with clear physical injuries, repeated STIs, suicide attempts, self-harm, and disclosures of sexual abuse. Staff recorded the evidence, treated the symptoms, and discharged the children back into the hands of their abusers without triggering safeguarding, making referrals or providing trauma care. This was not occasional oversight. It was consistent practice across multiple regions and services. Hospitals recorded physical injuries consistent with sexual assault, yet took no protective action, and sent the children home the same night. ADHD, autism, and addiction, directly linked to exploitation, received symptom-only treatment, with no connection made to grooming. Quick discharges returned traumatized children to the environments where the abuse continued. Physical and psychological harm from repeated sexual assault went unaddressed, leaving victims without coordinated medical or psychiatric care across the country. In addition to showcasing a chronic lack of professional curiosity, officials within the NHS also demonstrated a lack of collaborative, multi-agency and multidisciplinary coordination. Instead, NHS services tended to work in silos within their own departments, such that physical services, A&E, sexual health clinics, and the like, failed in many cases to collaborate or share information with mental health services. NHS Sexual Health Services, West Yorkshire. NHS Sexual Health Services treated a victim for multiple sexually transmitted infections, including gonorrhea and chlamydia, when she was only 13 years old. The clinics diagnosed and medicated her, but never triggered safeguarding procedures or reported the fact that a child was being repeatedly sexually abused by adult men. No child protection referral was made. The service treated the infections as a medical issue rather than evidence of organized child sexual abuse. Dr. Redacted, GP, Telford area. A general practitioner saw a victim with clear indicators of sexual exploitation, including injuries and behavioral changes consistent with repeated sexual assault. The doctor failed to ask safeguarding questions, failed to make any referral, and failed to protect the child despite the obvious red flags. Medical professionals, GPs, surgeons and consultants, redacted treating teams. GPs, surgeons, and consultants repeatedly recorded physical evidence of sexual abuse on a victim from infancy. Genital rashes, bowel problems, invasive treatments, and later severe injuries from extreme violence. Anal penetration, penetration with objects, strangulation, biting, and cutting. These professionals attributed the injuries to psychological causes, performed repeated invasive examinations without safeguarding action, and failed to protect her. Hospital and psychiatric services, multiple victims, including this victim and others. Hospital staff across several regions discharged children after serious suicide attempts, overdoses, and self-harm requiring stitches without safeguarding assessments or protection plans. In this victim's case, psychiatric detention and hospitalization occurred, while she was heavily medicated. Police interviews took place in that state with no trauma support. Physical injuries consistent with sexual assault were recorded, but no protective action followed. Children were sent home the same night. CAMHS and liaison services, redacted. Treating teams. Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, CAMHS, practitioner and associated services framed, redacted, disclosures of organized trafficking, filmed rape, blackmail, and extreme violence, red rooms, as mental health issues rather than organized crime. No escalation to protection or investigation followed the disclosures. Social care. Children's homes became trafficking hubs where staff failed to stop older men collecting girls at night. Local authorities often returned children to unsafe homes and placements despite repeated disclosures of grooming. Social workers dismissed parental concerns, removed parental authority in front of the children, closed cases without intervention, and saw their job as standing in for the parents themselves. Children in long-term care moved repeatedly between placements that exposed them to further abuse. Children received no long-term trauma support following removal from families. The state systematically failed the most vulnerable, and enabled the gangs to operate inside the care system. Social care across England systematically enabled organized grooming and the sexual abuse of children. Children's services, local authorities, foster carers, children's homes, and independent units repeatedly returned vulnerable children to known risk. Vulnerable young people who had already been groomed were placed in institutions that were known to be hubs for grooming gangs. This was not an isolated error. It was a nationwide problem and practice that lasted decades. According to the National Audit Office, the average cost to keep a child in a care home is £318,000 per year. To send a child to Eton, it costs £63,000 per year. The failures in social care are not due to a lack of financial resources, and have everything to do with the ideology that has permeated throughout our culture, as discussed earlier in this report. Redacted, Metropolitan Borough Council. One Metropolitan Borough Council failed every looked-after child in its semi-independent units. A whistleblower social worker formally disclosed financial abuse of care leavers, misuse of public funds, unlawful sanctions, illegal evictions, racism towards children in care, and systemic failures to safeguard against sexual and criminal exploitation. Senior officers, redacted 1, leaving care service manager, redacted 2, interim director of children's social care and early help, redacted 3, chief executive, redacted 4, leader, and redacted 5, head of corporate governance, acknowledged the concerns as credible yet conducted no proper investigation. Redacted 6, head of counter-fraud, and redacted 7, counter-fraud team manager, confirmed records had been destroyed, shredders purchased at units. The council deemed the whistleblowing reviewed, without interviewing her, and retaliated with suspension and isolation. Children remained in unsafe placements and the level of risks grew. No remedial action followed. Tameside Children's Services, Greater Manchester. Tameside Children's Services undermined Marlon's parental authority and placed his daughter in danger. A social worker privately acknowledged safeguarding failures, but the service told Marlon's daughter she could leave home and contact authorities if her father tried to stop her. Edge of care staff returned her to the exact farm where she had been sexually abused and destroyed forensic evidence. After an abuser threatened her life on bail, no protection followed. In Marlon's daughter's case, senior social worker, redacted, imposed deprivation of liberty safeguards, restricted family contact, dismissed disclosures, and misrepresented records. Agency social worker, redacted, Signed reports believed to have been authored by redacted. Social worker, redacted, failed to report Marlon's daughter's sexual assault and incomprehensibly returned her to the scene of the crime. The service treated the protective father as the problem and exposed the child to further grooming in care placements staffed entirely by Muslim men, where racist and extremist abuse occurred. Redacted, social services. Wolverhampton Social Services failed a mother and her daughter. Social worker, redacted, received repeated reports of adult men with the child, yet took no action. The service refused relocation requests, downgraded risk levels, and closed the case despite explicit statements that the child was being sexually exploited. The mother's own childhood grooming history was used to blame her as a parent. The NRM later recognized the child as a trafficking victim without informing the mother. Redacted counsel, redacted services. Redacted counsel and redacted social services removed a victim and her siblings from a loving family into care where abuse was worse. Social worker redacted, sexually abused the victim's sister and later married her. Another redacted social worker was forced to participate in a cover story to conceal abuse. The foster carer exploited the victim for labor and a redacted perpetrator isolated her. Management at the redacted children's home, staff including redacted and manager redacted physically and sexually abused children, handed them to taxi drivers for external exploitation, and covered it up. Records were concealed for nearly 40 years. Operation Marmion was shut down at senior level and no one was held accountable. Redacted social services. Staff at the redacted social services failed a mother and her child. The service minimized disclosures of forced conversion to Islam, forced Islamic marriage, coercive control, and threats framed in religious terms to remove her child. They treated religiously motivated abuse as a cultural or a relationship issue, and made decisions that resulted in parental alienation. Redacted placement, London. Staff at Redacted, a supposedly high-support, CCTV-covered children's home, dismissed a victim's disclosures of trafficking to adult men in Hounslow Flats as choice rather than exploitation. They did not believe another resident's report of abduction and sexual assault. Records from the placement are missing or destroyed. Social services in Redacted case, West Yorkshire. Social services knew a victim was associating with adult, South Asian men and being sexually abused, yet treated it as risky behavior or a lifestyle choice. They focused on contraception and sexual health checks rather than recognizing statutory rape. Foster placements failed to protect her and the abuse continued. Redacted social services in Redacted case. Social worker Redacted disbelieved the victim's disclosures, and her diary, strangely later went missing. Social work manager Redacted oversaw the response. Incomprehensibly enough, the service treated organized trafficking, blackmail with filmed sexual abuse, and red rooms as consensual. Social services in Redacted case, Telford. Social worker Redacted provided ineffective intervention despite repeated disclosures of organized gang rape facilitated by taxis, restaurants and women enforcers. Social services in Redacted case, Sheffield. Various social workers and safeguarding professionals implemented child protection plans that never removed a victim from organized houses in a redacted location, where Iraqi Kurdish Muslim men trafficked and molested her. They knew of the risks, yet failed to act decisively. General Children's Homes and Edge of Care failures. Redacted, and multiple other cases show that unnamed, children's home staff, and Edge of Care teams repeatedly encountered missing, intoxicated, and injured children with adult men, but failed to report sexual assaults, escalate risk or remove children from known exploitation environments. Placements became gateways for further abuse. Education. Schools across Britain watched the grooming gangs operate in plain sight, and did nothing to protect the children in their care. Teachers saw older men collecting girls at the school gates, heard direct disclosures of sexual acts in toilets, recorded truancy, self-harm and visible injuries, and witnessed children arriving at school with gifts, drugs or bruises. Instead of triggering safeguarding referrals, they excluded the victims, treated the exploitation as behavioral problems, and allowed the perpetrators to continue collecting children from school property. Education authorities failed to link obvious grooming indicators to organized crime, ignored parental reports, and placed excluded children into environments where the gangs operated. This was not oversight, it was active complicity that handed children to their abusers every single day. Redacted School, Telford. Staff at the redacted school observed older men collecting girls at the gates and heard direct disclosures of sexual activity in school toilets. They recorded truancy and self-harm clearly linked to exploitation. Teachers excluded victims for low-level disturbance, rather than safeguarding them. Referrals were rarely made, and children were treated as having behavioral problems instead of victims of organized gang sexual abuse. Taylor and her friends were collected openly from the school gates and transported to abusive locations while staff did nothing. Redacted, Merseyside. After 12-year-old autistic pupil, Redacted's daughter, disclosed oral rape, the redacted high school failed to separate her from the alleged perpetrator. Safeguarding measures were tokenistic and the boy remained in school. Her daughter faced relentless bullying and filmed assaults linked to the perpetrator. The school took no effective action. Police had already discouraged the sexual assault investigation and the school compounded the harm by leaving the child exposed. Her daughter died by overdose after the bullying and intimidation escalated. A mother's daughter. Schools ignored visible bruises, split lips, and black eyes on the mother's child from age 11. Teachers marked her as must try harder and doesn't mix without asking questions. When a sexual image of the mother's child, which she had been coerced into sending, was circulated across multiple schools, no safeguarding response followed. The school treated the exploitation as a behavioral issue rather than organized abuse. Taxi licensing. Taxi licensing authorities across Britain knowingly granted, renewed, and failed to revoke licenses for vehicles and drivers who formed the central transport and operational backbone of the grooming gangs. Perpetrators used taxis and private hire cars to collect children from school gates, care homes and streets, ferry them between towns for gang molestation, supplied drugs and alcohol, and returned them injured or unconscious. Licensing bodies possessed repeated intelligence linking named drivers and firms to organized exploitation, yet took no enforcement action, ignored background check failures, and surrendered to organized protests when basic safety measures such as CCTV were proposed. This failure was the active facilitation of child trafficking on a national scale. Redacted licensing authorities. Redacted licensing authorities failed a victim and dozens of other girls in the same network. Taxis and private hire vehicles were the primary method used to collect, transport, and exploit children across redacted area. Specific drivers and firms were repeatedly linked to the gangs through victim reports, police intelligence, and direct sightings. Licensing bodies took no action to revoke licenses or tighten background checks despite clear evidence of organized criminal use. When attempts were made to introduce CCTV in taxis, the council faced organized protests and backed down. The result was considerable mobility for the perpetrators and zero accountability for the licensing regime. Redacted council licensing. Redacted council licensing failed a victim, and every child handed over at the redacted children's home. Staff openly selected children and passed them directly to taxi drivers for sexual exploitation. This practice continued for years, in full view of the licensing authority. The council's licensing system enabled taxi drivers to operate as a direct extension of the abuse network inside a children's home. Redacted name. Redacted served as a redacted city councillor with direct responsibilities for safeguarding, licensing, and community safety. She received a WhatsApp exchange that concerned victims of grooming gangs. She made the deliberate decision to make the full exchange public. The disclosure triggered immediate political controversy, media coverage, and formal complaints followed by disciplinary processes against her. Redacted used the moment to highlight evidence of grooming gang activity within the redacted area, and to link passenger and women's safety in licensed vehicles directly to exploitation risks. Her actions exposed how local authorities continued to treat serious safeguarding concerns as political problems, rather than child protection emergencies. The incident further damaged public confidence in the redacted safeguarding systems and demonstrated that even elected councillors who attempted to raise the alarm faced institutional resistance instead of support. Part 62. Appendix 4. List of areas gangs are known to have operated. Local authority districts, 149. Aberdeen City, Angus, Antrim and Newtown Abbey, Argyll and Bute, Ashford, Aylesbury Vale, Barking and Dagenham, Barnsley, Barrow, Inverness, Bassetlaw, Bexley, Birmingham, Blackburn with Darwen, Blackpool, Bolton, Bournemouth, Bradford, Brent, Bristol, Bromley, Broxbourne, Broxtowe, Burnley, Bury, Calderdale, Cambridge, Camden, Canterbury, Carlisle, Castlepoint, Chelmsford, Charwell, Cheshire East, Cheshire West, Chester, Chiltern, Christchurch, City of Edinburgh, County Durham, Coventry, Craven, Croydon, Dacorum, Dartford, Derby, Doncaster, Dudley, Ealing, East Hertfordshire, East Riding of Yorkshire, East Staffordshire, Enfield, Epping Forest, Gateshead, Glasgow City, Greenwich, Hackney, Hammersmith and Fulham, Haringey, Harlow, Harrow, Hastings, Havering, High Peak, Hillingdon, Hounslow, Hyndburn, Ipswich, Isle of Wight, Islington, Kingston upon Hull, Kirklees, Lambeth, Lancaster, Leeds, Leicester, Lewisham, Liverpool, Luton, Manchester, Medway, Merton, Middlesbrough, Milton Keynes, Monmouthshire, Newcastle upon Tyne, Newcastle under Lyme, Newham, North Lincolnshire, North Tyneside, Northumberland, Norwich, Nottingham, Oldham, Oxford, Pembrokeshire, Pendle, Peterborough, Plymouth, Poole, Preston, Reading, Redbridge, Redditch, Richmond upon Thames, Rochdale, Rossendale, Rotherham, Sandwell, Sefton, Sheffield, Shropshire, Solihull, South Ayrshire, South Derbyshire, South Somerset, Southend-on-Sea, Southwark, St Helens, Stockport, Stoke-on-Trent, Sutton, Swansea, Swindon, Telford and Wrekin, Thanet, Thurrock, Tower Hamlets, Vale of White Horse, Wakefield, Walsall, Waltham Forest, Wandsworth, Warrington, Watford, West Berkshire, West Dunbartonshire, Westminster, Weymouth and Portland, Wigan, Wiltshire, Windsor and Maidenhead, Wirral, Wolverhampton, Worcester, Wychavon, Wickham, Wyre Forest, York. Our inquiry also found additional strong evidence of grooming gangs operating more widely within the following counties, albeit with a lower degree of specificity. Counties, 11. Derbyshire, Devon, Dorset, Greater Manchester, Greater London, Lancashire, Lincolnshire, Merseyside, Norfolk, Yorkshire, Warwickshire.